Our gospel reading for today contains probably two of the most quintessential healing stories that occur in Jesus' ministry. We pick up immediately on the heels of our reading from last week, following Jesus' encounter with the scribes and the Pharisees, and he is once again in search of some peace and some quiet. But once again, that just doesn't seem to be in the cards for him. As he travels to the region of Tyre, his efforts to remain incognito go unsuccessful. A woman whose daughter is possessed by an unclean spirit recognizes him, comes to him, beseeching him to heal her daughter and cast out the demon. Now, I have to say right off the bat that any passage that talks about unclean spirits immediately makes me a little uneasy. And in part, I think that's because I don't quite know what to do with that information. The notion of demons, spirits, possession, they are so at odds with our Western, post-Enlightenment, scientific lenses through which we view the world around us. There was a trend in biblical scholarship a while back to simply write off these kinds of references as an ancient way of explaining things that they just didn't have names for, like epilepsy or different psychological disorders. And that could very well be the case, but we have no real way of knowing that for sure. And it's not really appropriate for us to simply take our worldview and apply it to something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago. Plus, none of us can deny the fact that evil does exist in the world. We have all experienced it, come face to face with it at some point throughout the course of our lives, that darkness that is not so easily explained away by our modern way of understanding the world. And so, rather than rationalize it or try to explain it away, these stories, they invite us to sit in that discomfort, to suspend our need to understand and explain everything, and to focus on that which is of true importance in this passage, which is the healing grace of God. This exchange between Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman is awkward, to say the least. The text conveys a lot of information about her in just a few words. First off, she's a woman, and in that day and age, women were considered to be second-class citizens. We're told that she was Syrophoenician, which meant that ethnically she belonged to the people that inhabited the land before the arrival of the people of Israel. And those people were generally considered to be dangerous and wicked. And lastly, we're told that she was a Gentile, which means that she wasn't Jewish. She wasn't part of God's chosen people. So we have a woman who is a foreigner and not Jewish. That is 3 strikes against her right then and there. Someone like that had no right even approaching Jesus, who was a prominent, learned man, let alone actually speaking to him. And yet she does. She comes before him, she bows down, she asks him to heal her daughter, and what does Jesus do? He calls her a dog. He says, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Ouch. That is majorly harsh. Some scholars have tried to soften this, saying that Jesus' reference should be understood more along the lines of a cuddly puppy, but I'm not buying it. No, the word that Jesus uses translates to, well, it's exactly the word that you're thinking of, and it ain't one that we like to use in church. It almost feels like we're watching a commercial, and Simon Peter is going to say, "Someone get that man a Snickers bar, because Jesus, you're not you when you're hungry." But seriously, what is going on here? Maybe he was just having a bad day. He was trying to get away from the crowds, and that plan failed. In addition to being fully divine, Jesus was also fully human, and we've all been there. We've all responded more harshly than we mean to, said something that we don't really mean. That could be the case. Or it could be that this encounter is messing up his planned timeline for how things were supposed to unfold in his ministry. We know that Jesus came in part to show that the scope of God's mercy, grace, and love were expanded to include all people. But for whatever reason, maybe he was just not quite ready to drop that bombshell just yet. But this woman's daughter needs help now. And so she persisted. She insisted. And whether it's her faith that Jesus rewards, or it's her tenacity, or her well-reasoned counter-argument that he admires, the result is that her daughter is healed. Now, the second healing story that we have is a bit more straightforward. Jesus and his disciples return from Tyre, and they find themselves in the region of the Decapolis, when the group of people bring forward a man who is deaf with an impediment in his speech, and they beg Jesus to heal him. Jesus takes the man to the side, away from the crowds. He sticks his fingers in the guy's ear, and he spits and touches the guy's tongue. I love the famous Lutheran theologian Nadia Bolz-Weber's take on this passage when she says that this is clear evidence that Jesus never took a healthy boundaries workshop. But personal space and hygiene points aside, Jesus then looks up to heaven and says, Ephphatha, which means be opened. And suddenly the man can hear and speak plainly. Now, both of these are pretty meaty stories, and each one could have been a gospel reading on its own. So it's interesting that the folks that created the lectionary would pair them together. Perhaps it's because there's something more to be learned about the nature of healing when we look at these stories in relation to one another. So, what do they have in common? Interestingly, in both stories, it is not the person who is in need of healing that approaches Jesus. No, it's family members and friends advocating on their behalf. So for starters, it would appear that true healing takes place in the midst of relationship, of community. In many ways, I think we become our best selves when we take up the cause of someone that we love, when we advocate on behalf of someone else. Additionally, have you ever noticed that people are often far more willing to champion the needs of others than they are to fight for their own? This is a somewhat silly and trivial comparison to make, but if I'm at a restaurant and they mess up my friend's order or forget to bring something, I won't hesitate to speak up and advocate on their behalf to the server. But if my order gets messed up, crickets. I am so much more comfortable fighting for someone else than I am fighting for myself. How many of you feel that way? Now, to a certain extent, that's just what it means to be a good person. Now, being a good person means that you put your own well-being and happiness behind that of others, right? You do what you can to right what is wrong, to seek justice when and where it's possible. And if that's your motivation, that's amazing. But when our willingness to fight for others, but not for ourselves, is motivated instead by feeling that we are less deserving than others, that's when we start to get into trouble. That line of reasoning can cause us to downplay our own importance, to minimize our own pain and truly our own need of healing. We end up trying to make ourselves, as small as possible and take up as little room as we can, and that is not what God wants for us at all. Because we are also deserving. We are also worthy of receiving that same love and healing and justice that we advocate for on behalf of everyone but ourselves. You are worthy of God's healing love, not because of anything that you have done, but simply because of who you are, a beloved child of God. I think one of the other reasons that it's easier to advocate on behalf of others is that it's easier to talk about other people's need of healing, to focus on their brokenness than it is to admit that we are just as broken and just as in need of healing as everyone else. Because, if we admit to needing to be healed, that means adopting a very vulnerable, honest, and open posture, and that can be a really scary thing to do. Which is why I love that when Jesus heals the man in the second vignette, he says, "Ephphatha," be opened. When I was in middle school, I went through this phase where I really loved reading nautical fiction. It all started with the amazing Age of Sail program that I did in 5th grade, where we got to spend the night on the C.A. Thayer down at the San Francisco Maritime Pier. And I really got into this book series written by Alexander Kent that chronicled the adventures of Richard Bolitho, a fictional member of the British Royal Navy. The books follow him as he rises through the ranks from lieutenant all the way up to admiral. And in one of the books, Bolitho had a superior officer on board his ship when suddenly they come under fire. And the commanding officer is hit in the chest by a piece of wooden shrapnel. Rather than seek medical help, the officer retreats to his cabin where he wraps bandages around the shrapnel and his wound and refuses to come out. As you can imagine, things don't go so well for that officer, and he ends up dying from his wounds. Whether it was pride or fear or denial, whatever it was, he refused to let anyone else help him. He turned inward on himself, tried to cover and ignore what were very obviously life-threatening wounds. The lesson of that book has stuck with me for nearly 20 years. How many of us do the same thing? How many of us hide our hurts away from the world, whether they be physical, psychological, emotional, or spiritual wounds? We try to divert attention away from ourselves by pointing out the brokenness of others in the hopes that people won't see how we too are broken and in need of healing as well. Perhaps it's because we are too proud or too fearful of the pain that the healing process might involve, or because we either feel like we deserve to live with those hurts or we don't deserve to be healed and made whole. We act like that officer, pretending that everything is fine to our own detriment. This past Wednesday, I attended a gathering of the San Diego Interfaith Ministerial Association, or SEDIMA, and we heard a presentation from one of the members of the Baha'i community here in Encinitas. She talked about their daily prayers and how there are different genuflections, different positions and postures that they adopt during different parts of the prayer. There's this one section where they pray on both knees with their head to the ground, but when they reach this portion of the prayer where they confess their sins, they adopt an upright and open posture. Feet spaced evenly apart, shoulders back, palms and chin up. That is the posture that I associate with Jesus' words, "Be opened." Martin Luther described our default human state as being naturally turned in on ourselves, incurvatus in se in Latin. But through the healing grace, mercy, and love of God, we can leave that posture of self-absorption, that posture of self-defense, that posture of being closed off from the people and the world around us, and instead be opened and ultimately be healed. So, dear people of God, what is it in your life that needs healing? What have you shut down, closed off to others, and maybe even to yourself? Hear the words of Jesus, "Ephphatha," and be opened by the healing grace of his love. Amen.